Internationaal werd hij bekend als de man met de gouden handen. De wonderjongen van de Amerikaanse auto-industrie. Ingenieur John DeLorean begon als ontwerper en maakte een bliksemcarrière in de autobranche. Een carrière die hem een toppositie bracht als directeur bij het grootste autobedrijf ter wereld, General Motors. In 1970 begon John DeLorean zijn eigen autobedrijf in het Ierse Belfast. Daar bouwde hij een revolutionair type auto, de sportwagen van de toekomst. De gestroomlijnde auto, de roestvrij carrosserie, werden de droom van iedere autoliefhebber. In 1981 werd de wagen enorm populair. Nieuwe bestellingen stroomden zo snel binnen dat de fabriek de productie ervan nauwelijks kon bijhouden. Dit tot grote vreugde van de Ierse regering en de bijna 3000 werknemers van de fabriek. Maar plotseling sloeg het noodlot toe. De fabrikage kwam tot een abrupt einde en half in elkaar gezette auto's bleven op de montageband staan. Alle personeelsleden werden naar huis gestuurd en het eens zo bloeiende autobedrijf veranderde in een grote, spookachtige ruimte.
They destroyed my life, my company, my family. My children have been horribly distorted and their minds have been affected grossly by what went on.
Wat is het verhaal van deze ex-miljonair? Een internationale beroemdheid. En waarom is zijn leven en zijn carrière geruïneerd?
Well, I was born in Detroit, Michigan, and I lived between Detroit and Los Angeles throughout my younger life. My father was a factory worker. Both my parents were immigrants. My father was from Middle Europe, and my mother was from Hungary. My father from eastern part of France, and my father was a factory worker all the life that I knew him. I worked in a foundry at the Ford Motor Company. As a Detroiter, obviously, you either spend your life in the automobile business or you leave Detroit, because that's really literally a one-industry town. And consequently, I worked for Chrysler. I went through the Chrysler Institute, got my master's degree in automotive engineering, later became the director of research for Packard, and from there, when Packard went bankrupt, I went to work for General Motors. Eventually, in about 17, 18 years, I rose to the position of group executive in charge of all their North American car and truck operations, which is about 85% of General Motors' profitability. And I think the last 5 men who've had that job became the president of General Motors. But having been a group executive and a chief engineer as an operating executive, that was something I enjoyed very much. But when I became a group executive, suddenly you were spending your life in meetings day in and day out, week in and week out, with the same 28 or 30 people. And I just decided that wasn't something I could do and enjoy for the last 18 years of my working life. So I just decided to leave and start my own automobile company.
But you had a tremendous income.
Yeah, I expected that I would suffer a substantial loss of income, but I decided that the most important thing is to enjoy your life and to do things that... I've always been accomplishment-oriented. Money's never meant very much to me. And I felt that I had other things I wanted to do and places I could contribute.
In de jaren 60 en 70 maakte General Motors dankbaar gebruik van de vele vernieuwingen die John DeLorean invoerde bij het ontwerpen van nieuwe auto's. Toen DeLorean een sportwagen ontwierp, die naar hem genoemd werd, kwam hij in de gelegenheid om van de geëikte modellen af te stappen en al zijn ideeën in één auto te verwerken.
It was a tragedy to spend all of these economic, physical, natural, and human resources and build a product that had such a limited life. In those days, it was unusual for a car in America to last more than 8 or 9 years. And so I decided I'd like to build a car that embodied a lot of the characteristics that I thought were important. And that was the reason that ultimately the car I built was in stainless steel, because I felt a car should be built in a manner that would last essentially forever. And when you disposed of it because you were tired of it, not because it was worn out or rusted out or broken down. And I then set up this company. We did a lot of the preliminary design and development work, and then I started searching about as a method of financing it. And it was very, very difficult because the last successful American automobile company was the Chrysler Corporation, which was founded by Walter Chrysler in 1924, some 60 years earlier, and nobody had succeeded in the meantime. So that it was judged by the investment community, not only in America but throughout the world, that our project was such a high risk that we couldn't get any kind of financial support. Well, ultimately, after talking to a number of the governments around the world, we wound up in Northern Ireland, largely because no one else would have us because we were such a high risk, and nobody else would have Northern Ireland because they were such a high risk. So it's like two grotesquely ugly people who marry each other because no one else will have them. And it turned out to be a pretty good wedding. We built our plant there in world record time. We built it on a battlefield between Protestant and Catholic housing developments. I think on the field we were on, some 60 or 70 people had been killed over the centuries.
Gedurende het eerste jaar dat de fabriek draaide, in de tweede helft van 1981, maakte DeLoreans bedrijf de ongelooflijke winst van bijna 100 miljoen gulden. De geweldige populariteit van zijn sportwagen was overduidelijk bewezen. Er waren voldoende orders om 2 jaar lang continu te kunnen draaien. Voordat de winst werd gemaakt was DeLorean financieel afhankelijk van een miljoenenlening van de Britse regering. Zonder deze eerste steun zouden de auto's niet geproduceerd kunnen worden.
When Mrs. Thatcher's conservative government came in, she decided that they were not going to support any more government-owned businesses. And as you know, since they've sold off British Petroleum and they're selling British Airways, British Telecom, British Steel, British Leyland, as well as the 300 or 400 minor development companies such as ours that they had investments in. So when she came in, they just refused to honor our contract. And the only part that we required at that time was a working capital. We had no working capital. We didn't have 10 cents to buy one screw. Everything we were counting on was to come from the British government. And under the terms of our agreement, they owed us some $93 million worth of working capital, and they just refused to honor that. This, tragically, here was a company that had been profitable. We were employing 2,600 people and building cars that have been very, very well accepted here in the country. I had lunch with the head of the DeLorean Owners Club here about a month ago, and he said the people just love the automobile. It's outside of a few minor early problems, it's totally trouble-free. But the tragedy was that she didn't want any more government-owned business, so they put our company in receivership. And of course, that put me into a worldwide quest for financing. I was talking to anybody and everybody who might have any potential to provide some funding to our company.
Een van zijn tips bracht hem naar Los Angeles in Californië. Daar vertelde James Hoffman, een misdadiger die eens 2 van zijn beste vrienden aan de FBI verraadde om zelf vrijgesproken te worden, de FBI dat DeLorean een drugshandelaar was. En Hoffman wist wel hoe DeLorean gepakt kon worden. In dit hotel ontmoette James Hoffman John DeLorean voor het eerst. Hoffman gaf zichzelf uit als een vertegenwoordiger van potentiële beleggers en hij begon zijn spelletje om John DeLorean in een val te lokken.
And he said, I have some people who have money to invest, and if your company can still be saved, we would be interested in investing. At that point in time, he gave me as a bank reference one of the president of one of the largest banks in the San Francisco area. I called the president of the bank, who had incidentally later turned out to be a FBI agent, and he said yes, and the informant's name was Hoffman. He said, yes, Mr. Hoffman has an 8-figure account with us, which is up to $100 million. He has excellent credit. We have good references, and on his recommendation, we would be willing to do financing for your company, dealer financing, sales to customers, and so on and so on. Best reference I've ever gotten in my 35 years in business. So on that basis, we started to negotiate. We went through a period of about 2.5 months of the president of the bank, the chairman of the bank, and the informant promising me investment at various levels, always absolutely legitimate. Well, then suddenly, about 2.5 months later, the informant made a proposal in which he said he was going to take the commission that he would have earned for providing this investment and put it in a narcotics transaction. Well, as soon as he said that, I tried to get away from them. I called my attorneys, and I said, I don't know, what should I do about this? And my attorneys in New York. And they plotted out a strategy, and I said, well, if it's indeed members of organized crime, and you know, organized crime in America has hold of a lot of big businesses, and if you judge by the fact that they have refused to indict the head of the Teamsters, they have connections right up to the top of the Department of Justice. In any event, my attorney said, well, if these people, the president of the bank and the chairman of this big bank, you're talking about a multi-billion-dollar 44-branch bank, are part of this, then they probably do have connections right up to the top of the Department of Justice. So if you try to turn them in, you'd probably be killed. So they made a recommendation to me that I'd basically procrastinate without confrontation and go along with anything they said, except don't give them any money, don't take any money, and don't make any kind of a deal. But just be nice and don't make them mad at me. Eventually they'll get bored and leave you alone. At that point in time, we can see that the names and the people get to the proper authorities. Of course, the alternative then would have been, if I had gone to the government, they would have asked me to become a witness against them and eventually have to change my identity and move off to the Netherlands as a shopkeeper somewhere to save my life. Well, I couldn't do that because that was the end of my company and my wife's career anyhow. Here I was trapped because these people were threatening my life, and later they threatened the lives of my children. When I tried to withdraw from all of this, they said, look, if you do that, we're going to kill your baby daughter and send her head home in a shopping bag. And it was just a revolting kind of a thing, and I really was in desperation. In any event, I finally, after just plain telling them I didn't want anything to do with it and these threats, they demanded that I come out to California because their so-called transaction was going to be closed.
De vliegreis van DeLorean van New York naar Los Angeles was een van de meest pijnlijke ervaringen in zijn leven. Voor hij vertrok stuurde hij een brief naar zijn advocaat met instructies. Op de brief schreef hij: dit schrijven bevat instructies voor het geval ik deze ontmoeting niet overleef. John was ervan overtuigd dat er een val voor hem was opgezet door machtige criminelen. Maar hij voelde dat er geen andere keus voor hem was dan een ontmoeting met deze criminelen in Californië. Wel verwachtte hij dat deze ontmoeting de laatste van zijn leven zou worden.
I thought I was going to die. I never thought that I'd ever come back alive. But I thought at that point in time there was no more chance or no more need for them to hurt my children. Anyhow, I get out to California, and instead of going to the bank and taking the new owners to the company down in Orange County to introduce them to the management, they took me to this hotel room.
Deze videobeelden van de hotelkamer waren gemaakt door een verborgen camera geplaatst door de FBI. Dit wordt in Amerika wel vaker gedaan als men bewijzen probeert te verzamelen tegen iemand die een misdaad heeft begaan. Alle mensen die DeLorean hier ontmoeten zijn FBI-agenten die zich uitgeven als leden van georganiseerde misdaad.
They sat and they talked for some period of time about legitimate investment, and then all of a sudden they ran to the closet and they dragged out this suitcase full of paper bags, which of course is this videotape that and at that time I'm just trying to go along with them because again, as I say, I thought I was going to die. And people have asked, why didn't you get up then and say, I'm going to the police? Well, if you're sitting with 3 armed criminals, you're not going to do that. In fact, they asked a number of the agents on the stand in court, what would you have done? They said, we would have done exactly what he did. You couldn't confront him or you'd die right then and there. So in any event, that's what happened. And then, of course, a minute later, the FBI agent comes in and arrests me.
Vanwege zijn samenwerking met hen dachten de FBI-agenten genoeg bewijs te hebben om aan te tonen dat John DeLorean van plan was deel te nemen in de verkoop en het vervoer van een enorme drugstransactie. Hij werd gepakt, geboeid en daarna las men hem zijn rechten voor.
Up to that point, I thought I was dead. Suddenly I realized that I wasn't going to die, but I also knew that I was innocent of I'd never done anything wrong, so that I knew that ultimately it would come out okay. So I really, in a way, felt relieved by the whole thing.
want to advise you, you're right.
Of course, as once I'd been arrested, it was incidentally became very obvious the whole thing was a media circus, because by the time I'd been arrested at the hotel and taken down to the car to drive down to the Federal Building downtown, one of the agents turned on the radio, and at that time the head of the Department of Justice out here was giving a press conference before 200 reporters who had been assembled previously in anticipation of what was going on. In any event, I went through some, I thought, unnecessarily humiliating. You know, here's a guy who's never done one violent thing in his life, and every time they had moved me from one place to another, they made sure that I was shackled and in leg irons to portray a aura of criminality, which I thought was really totally outrageous. But in any event, I wound up at the Terminal Island prison while they were my wife and family were trying to put bail together to, of course, have me released up to the point of trial. And I think I was there a total of 10 or 11 days. They had set my bail at $20 million. Now, which is unheard of. I think it's the highest bail they've ever put on any American in their history, including all of the members of mafia bosses and everyone else. And of course, that was designed to try to prevent my access to funds to defend myself. In any event, suddenly you're in the middle of a prison with murderers, bank robbers, terrorists, spies. You know, you start to wonder, what did I do wrong? You know, what is this? And at that point in time, my wife had brought me a Bible, an NIV Bible, and I started reading it, and I had this compulsion to read it right from the first light of the dawn until the lights went out at 11 o'clock at night, constantly.
You started right at the beginning in Genesis?
I just read. I couldn't put it down. I read and read. And an unusually fortuitous circumstance was that one of the guards there, a young black man, was a theological student mornings, and he was a guard from 4 till midnight on the second shift. So he spent a lot of time with me. We talked about Jesus. We talked about the stories of the Bible and what they meant, and then we had little Bible studies in some of the cells. But it was really an incredible experience for me, and because of the vacuum of my life at that time, it was very, very impressive. In any event, after this went on for about 10 days, the day before I was released, I was standing in my cell reading the Bible, and it was on the upper bunk. And I think I was reading in Romans, and it was late afternoon. The sun was just descending. It was a violent red sunset. And all of a sudden, I felt this incredible experience, like nothing that I've ever... in fact, I have great difficulty describing it, and I get very emotional talking about it, but I felt like I was being embraced right from the top of my head to the soles of my feet, in a warm and wonderful, just like my mother had me in her arms. And the Lord was saying to me, don't worry, everything's going to be all right. And whether this lasted for 5 minutes or 25 or 55, I couldn't tell you, but I've never experienced anything like it. But I could feel all the cares lifting off my shoulders, and never once from that point to this have I experienced any sensation of fear or trepidation, concern, or anything else, because I really do know that everything is going to be all right. And remarkably, that's exactly what's happened. Whatever problem faces me, I just give it to the Lord, and He takes care of it. But it's been a truly remarkable thing for me, and the strength that my faith has given me is unbelievable. Well, you see me now. Do I look like a guy who's concerned? I have 2 governments pursuing me who so far have spent something over $40 million, and they're still harassing me, basically for nothing. But it's really been a marvelous source of power. And an interesting part of that is in the previous 2 years before all this happened, I think I'd made some 43 transatlantic flights. And I was a mess. I was, my internal time clock was screwed up. I had bad headaches constantly. I was taking up to 40 aspirin a day. Every night to go to sleep, I had to take sleeping pills, and that was even true in prison. All of a sudden, I've never taken a sleeping pill since. I sleep like a baby. I haven't had a headache since, nor do I think I'll ever have another one. And, I'm a different human being. But the interesting part of it is, in Psalm 27, he says that don't worry, I'll protect you and I'll make your enemies stumble and fall. And that is exactly what happened in court, because never has the Department of Justice of our country ever been so totally humiliated in their history, because agents were caught fabricating evidence. 3 levels of government were caught backdating documents illegally. They were caught threatening witnesses. They threatened my attorney. They tried to plant narcotics in my attorney's car. Just one thing after another. And all of these came out in court in the most unbelievable fashion. And then finally, one of the agents, who was a case agent, thought what was being done to me was such a total miscarriage of justice and such a gross injustice that he left the agency, and he later elected to come and testify for us. And so consequently, we literally didn't put on any defense. Every single person who testified was a government agent or ex-agent, with the exception of my ex-secretary, who only testified that certain documents that had been submitted were indeed typed and written by her. But everybody else was a government. We did not put on a defense because we didn't have to. They totally proved that I was absolutely innocent, that the whole thing was fabricated.
Het was een gelukkig moment voor John DeLorean toen hij het gerechtsgebouw van San Francisco verliet. Bij de eerste stemming reeds verklaarde een jury dat hij niet schuldig was aan enig misdrijf of aan welk voornemen dan ook een misdaad te begaan. De advocaat van John, Howard Weitzman, hield ten behoeve van John een indrukwekkend betoog voor de verzamelde nationale en internationale pers. Hij verklaarde ook waarom het zo'n belangrijke rechtszaak was geweest voor het Amerikaanse strafrechtelijke systeem.
The first comment I want to make is that the jury involved in this case consists of 12 very courageous people. The message they want to send, and the message that has been sent to the country at large, to all of our citizens, is that we won't tolerate the type of conduct the government involved in this particular incident. Our citizens will not tolerate setting up an individual, creating crimes, choreographing videotapes, using informants the like of James Hoffman, the bottom of the barrel, the scum of the earth. That our citizens will not tolerate government lawyers or government agents becoming involved in setting up individuals. With respect to the individual case, John's feelings and my feelings, we are thankful to see that the system of justice and the jury system really can and does work in the United States of America.
Aangezien John van alle blaam gezuiverd was, besloot hij over het ongelooflijke en ongeloofwaardige drama een boek te schrijven. En hoe dat zijn leven veranderde. Dit boek verscheen begin dit jaar.
Since that time, I have never said a word at all to anybody ever until I wrote this book, which is essentially my side of the story, which no one has heard.
John DeLoreans levensstijl is ook aanmerkelijk veranderd. Deze kapitale gebouwen vormden zijn voormalig bezit en ze vertegenwoordigden een uiting van de hoogste sociale klasse waarvan hij eens deel uitmaakte. 5 jaar geleden zou er geen feest denkbaar zijn of geen belangrijke gebeurtenis plaatsvinden zonder de aanwezigheid van de DeLoreans. Maar dit is allemaal verleden tijd voor John en nu leeft hij voor de toekomst.
What I've learned and the humility and the experiences that I've gone through have served me well. Of course, they've been very painful. It's very, very hard for me because, of course, at this time, my good name, my family, my business, my company has been destroyed. Everything I own has essentially been tied up or taken away from me. But I really feel like I'm a much stronger and better person, particularly because of my faith. And so I think the best is still ahead of me.
You said you were a celebrity and, well, if you're a celebrity, you have a lot of friends. What happens when something like this happens?
Well, they all disappear. And it's incredible, although that in itself is a pretty good lesson, because a real friend, I've always been the kind of friend that when you got in trouble, I was there and whatever I had was yours. But unfortunately, and not universally, but 99% of them did disappear. And in a way, that just teaches you that they weren't really friends in the first place, because by definition, that's what a friend is supposed to be.
Even your wife?
Well, even my, well, I don't blame my wife for what happened. I don't think any marriage could have suffered or could have survived the horror and the terror that we were subject to. You got to remember, you're stripped of everything you own. Your children are subject to abuse of other children, of other people. Every time they turn on the television set, there's their father on TV. It was just too much pressure, and I can't imagine any marriage surviving that.
What will the future bring you, John?
Well, several things. One is that, obviously I'd like to put my car back in production, which we seem to be in the process of doing. And incidentally, it's interesting because it's infinitely easier to raise money this time than it was the last time. I think that the people recognize that I was able to do it, and I think most of them understand that the British government did destroy our business. And, some interesting things have happened since then. When it looked like we were about to get the car back into production, the British government took the body dies, which are the most expensive single component and the longest lead time. I think they're probably worth $18–20 million. And they took them out in the middle of Galway Bay and threw them in the ocean. So if there's any question in anybody's mind that they clearly didn't want me to succeed, that certainly proves it, especially because there are 9,000 owners of cars who counted on both our company and the British government to provide spare parts. And of course, without the dies, if you have an accident, your car is useless because you can't buy any spare parts. So I think it's outrageous. It's against the law in every country of the world. So in any event, we want to put the car back in production. We've now hired some divers to go down and recover the tooling and see if hopefully the ocean hasn't been too corrosive to these. But in any event, that should happen fairly soon. But in the meantime, I'm also involved in several ministries which are taking a big part of my life. One is a home for the homeless in San Diego called a New Start in Life Center, and another ministry of my own which involves a process of adopting families. People in well-to-do communities adopt families in ghetto communities through the mechanism of their respective churches, so that this is the way we're going to bring the poor and the young people out of the ghettos of this country.
What of all what happened to you is the most important and most valuable thing for you through all the despair and the pain you went through?
Well, I think the most important thing is that God gave the life of his only son, that we would first would not only have our sins forgiven, but that we would have eternal life. That's such a powerful thing, and there's no demonstration of love that anybody can think of that comes close to that. It's the proof positive. And having that feeling, and no matter how you feel about yourself, the fact that Jesus died for you and he died for me, that's an incredible thing to comprehend.